Hey, good morning. Let's talk about some of the democratic reforms in Britain during this time period of the 19th century. Um, Britain is kind of different from the other countries we've been talking about because Britain already had basically moved from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy in the 18th century. So, really, the changes that they're going through are more reform, not revolution. For example, they had a constitutional monarchy. They had a parliament where one house, the House of Commons, was elected. The House of Lords was a hereditary body. They had two political parties. They had a large number of people that could vote, but it was only 5% of the people. Only landowners could vote, and only people who belonged to the Church of England could either vote or hold office. There were a series of reforms that started to pass in the early 19th century. Probably the biggest one was the Reform Act of 1832. The main thing that this did is it redistributed how the seats in the House of Commons were apportioned, and it did allow more people to vote, although they did keep the property requirements. The big winners of this were the middle class. There was a movement in the 1830s called the Chartist movement that wanted to put even more reforms into place. They failed, but later governments in Britain implemented them. Some of these things were universal male suffrage. All men could vote regardless of property requirements, to have annual elections, and also to have secret ballots. Voting in the 19th century involved people voting out loud in front of a registrar. So there was no confidentiality, there were no secrets. So, people wanted to have secret ballots. This is also the Victorian age. This is when Queen Victoria comes to power. She ruled for quite a long time, as you can see from the dates. Um, Her personality did much to influence this time period. So the characteristics you see listed here, the ideas of duty, thrift, honesty, hard work, respectability, all of these things are part of Queen Victoria's personality. She really was devoted to her family. In your text, you can read how devoted she was to her husband, even to the point of wearing black for the rest of her life after he died. But she became a symbol, and a very powerful symbol at that. And she also favored these social reforms, which is probably one of the things that pushed these reforms a little bit farther along than if she hadn't been there. There are two prime ministers you need to be familiar with during this time period, William Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli. They're kind of like opposite sides of the same coin. Gladstone was a member of what became known as the Liberal Party. Benjamin Disraeli became a member of the Conservative Party. Both of them, though, were reformers. So while they have that distinction of being liberal or conservative, they each work to expand suffrage, to help make Britain more of a parliamentary democracy rather than a constitutional monarchy. So by the time Gladstone and Disraeli were done, Britain's government basically was ran by prime ministers. Prime ministers were the major force within the government. Um, Within the parliamentary system, you also have the legislative branch and executive branches very closely tied together. As you can see in the notes here, the prime minister and the cabinet come from the legislative branch. So whoever is the majority party in the House of Commons, their leading member becomes the prime minister. There were a lot of economic and social reforms in this time period. They repealed the Corn Laws, which restricted the grain that could be brought into England. It was protecting the big landowners there, but it kept food prices very, very high. One of the things that repealing this law did is it lowered the cost of food, and it also started to promote free trade. I think, in my own personal opinion, one of the biggest things that these people did is they abolished slavery in the 1830s. They purchased all the slaves and then set them free. So they avoided a civil war, unlike the United States. They did reduce the number of capital offenses, things that could get people executed. They also, though, pushed for penal colonies. So places like Australia became locations where criminals were sent so that they wouldn't be in England, but they would be sent off someplace else. There were also lots of improvements for the working class, what we would call basically social welfare, an emphasis on safer working conditions, limits on child labor, protections for women. Labor unions were recognized, free public education. The one thing that they lagged behind, though, was giving suffrage to women. They didn't actually achieve that till after World War I. Big burning question in the 19th century in Britain was the Irish question. What was to be done with Ireland? A lot of people in Ireland wanted their own independence, wanted more liberties, more freedoms. One of the things that did happen in the early 19th century to help them with this was the Catholic Emancipation Act, which allowed Catholics in Ireland to vote and hold political office. There was a tremendous disaster that happened in Ireland in the 1840s called the potato famine. There was plenty of food in Ireland, but the landlords, who were largely absentee, they didn't live there, insisted that food be grown for export to other places. The Irish depended upon the potato for their sustenance. And when there was a blight that hit the potato crop and destroyed it, the regular poor Irish worker had nothing to eat, but the landlords did not do anything to feed them. So the catastrophe that happened resulted in a quarter of the Irish population either dying or immigrating to other places like the United States. The saying is that God caused the blight, but man caused the famine. And this shook up a lot of people. And so the idea that the Irish needed to govern themselves really starts to come into the forefront. This push for home rule, for self-government, was finally granted right at the beginning of World War I, but they didn't really get their full independence till 1821. Okay, so this concludes this slide. Thank you.